I think if she chooses to, she could be a powerful inspiration for that, Doug. Depending on how she feels, how strong she feels. There's one thing I would like to note to your viewing audience, that you best believe that most survivors are trying to work through this pain. It's unhealable. You can't heal it. But people, at least, who they lean on or try to at least help them cope at some decent level of dealing with this kind of event and pain that's attached with it, try to at least push them forward to maybe do great things. But it's going to be up totally to Tamika Palmer on how she wants to move forward in this community and how she wants to advocate for what she wants to advocate for.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. I'm going to let you go. That's Christopher Tuax here in town, who has been with the family from the beginning and was with them in Frankfort in the room with Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron when he presented the evidence to them today, and the fact that he has determined that they followed the law justified with their use of force. On the phone with me now is also former prosecutor with the Jefferson County Attorney's Office. He's now defense attorney Carl Price. Carl, you've also looked at some of the evidence, even looked over those warrants. Give me your reaction both to the grand jury today and what you heard the Attorney General say here in his news conference.
Well, Doug, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. So my reaction, first of all, to the charges, I'll tell you the charges. I think the charges, as we have them now, against Detective Hankinson, or ex-Detective Hankinson, I think it's appropriate. I think I mentioned that very early. And obviously, if there were ballistic results that revealed that his firearm may have been one of the fatal bullets to Miss Taylor, then it should have been wanton murder. In terms of the grand jury, let me just say this. I take issue with the Attorney General when he says, as a former prosecutor, as he says that it was the grand jury's decision. He said that a number of times. The problem I have with that is that while I appreciated that there were wanton endangerment charges against Detective Hankinson, I'm a little bit concerned. Maybe the Attorney General has not fully appreciated the grand jury process and what prosecutors do there. But a grand jury is not a petty jury. A petty jury is where there's two parties, generally two parties. They present their case to the jury, and the jury makes a decision. The grand jury is a little bit different. There's only the prosecutor there. So it's not really a monumental fact-finding process. And when you look at the time that the grand jury had this case, and this has been 6 months in the making, it clearly was not the grand jury's decision. I heard a number of reporters ask the question that I thought was very relevant: what charges did you recommend? And the Attorney General refused to answer that. And I think that's important. I think that's very important because 95% of the time, what the prosecutor recommends is what the grand jury will come back at unless they have an issue with it. So, the press conference was a very, very interesting press conference, but I would tell you that initially I was happy to see that there were some charges and, at least against Detective Hankinson, but now I'm a little bit troubled by a couple of things. Let me just say this real quick, a couple of things. One, that you had the Kentucky State Police Lab with their ballistics testing came back with one result, and using almost exactly the same method and procedures and devices that, and professionals, if you will, that the FBI lab uses, and then the FBI lab comes back with a lot more conclusive results. My other concern, Doug, is that I don't think we really know everything at this point. When you hear the Attorney General comment, as limited as he did about what was presented to the grand jury, about the other 5 bullets, although he identified a bullet that the medical examiners did not identify, but the other 5 bullets as to their source and who they came from. What firearm did those bullets come from? Because if there is still a question about whether there was a bullet that came from Hankinson's firearm that was fatal to Breonna Taylor, then there should still be a murder investigation.
Carl, is there anything that came out of that news conference that surprised you? And do you agree with his determination that they were justified with the use of force based on Kentucky state law? Since your review of the law has been on both sides.
I do not agree with that, Doug. I do not agree with that. And full disclosure, I don't know everything about the facts in terms of where Miles was, but there's some suggestion that only Mattingly was in the apartment, and then all of a sudden, Miles was behind him. Where was Miles behind him? Did Miles just stick his gun into the doorway and start firing without knowing who he was firing with because he heard a shot, because he saw Mattingly was hit? I don't know. I think that I was actually shocked to hear about that involvement of Miles, and that the ballistics resulted that it was Miles' firearm that actually released the fatal bullet. So no, I don't completely agree with that. I think that there probably should be some more investigation here, because I think there's something more here. Credit to the Attorney General's office for picking up the ball and trying to run with it to the goal line. I'm not quite sure if they got to the goal line on this one.
Okay, Carl Price, I thank you very much for your insight and your reviews on this. Yes, I think you bring up some highlights of some of the headlines here. That KSP lab determination certainly puzzling the Attorney General as well. That's why he took it to the FBI in Quantico, Virginia. And also the involvement of Miles Cosgrove. Of course, speculation had been rampant throughout the community because we knew the officers who had fired shots were Jonathan Mattingly. He said so in a recorded interview 2 weeks after the shooting when he got out of the hospital. And of course, Brett Hankison fired for the shots he found. Just getting word from our newsroom, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear will be coming up here at 4 o'clock to respond to the grand jury findings and most likely talk about Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron's role here. I'm being told he's also going to be joined by Charles Booker of Louisville, the former U.S. Senate candidate, and J. Michael Brown, who is part of his administration. So we've now heard some of the findings from the Kentucky Attorney General, which filled in some of the mysteries, some of the things that had not been determined. Let's go back and look at the case. As we know from the evidence as it was coming together from that night. It was Friday morning, March 13th.
Civil unrest on Louisville city streets. Weeks of protest, calls for change. But how did we get here?
Okay, I think you can't lose action if anybody...
To Thursday, March 12th. Judge Mary Shaw signs off on 5 warrants as part of a large narcotics investigation. 3 warrants were for properties on Elliott Avenue in West Louisville. Detectives wrote they were looking for drugs, weapons, electronics, and mail related to illegal drug activity. A 4th warrant was for a house on Muhammad Ali. And then this warrant for 26-year-old Breonna Taylor's South Louisville apartment. How was Taylor connected? She wasn't the main suspect in the case, but she was named on the warrant. Detectives say in January of this year, they witnessed their main suspect, Jamarcus Glover, arrive at Taylor's apartment, go inside, and then come back out with a package. Police say Glover then got into his car and drove to the Muhammad Ali address, which the detective called a known drug house. The warrant goes on to say that a U.S. postal inspector verified that Glover had been receiving packages at Taylor's apartment, and that it is not uncommon for drug traffickers to receive mail packages at different locations to avoid detection from law enforcement. Detectives also wrote they believe Glover may be keeping narcotics or proceeds from the sale of narcotics inside Taylor's apartment for safekeeping. On the night of March 12th, Detective John Mattingly and several others were briefed on the plan. Mattingly says he drove by Taylor's apartment around 11:45 to scope it out. And then, around 12:30 on the morning of March 13th, officers parked in front of Breonna Taylor's building and walked up to her door.
When SWAT was doing their thing down at 2-4 in Madison, we went over, or Elliott, whatever it was. We executed ours at the same time.
About 10 miles away, officers executed a warrant at a different property on Elliott Avenue. There, police found their main suspect, Glover, and arrested him. Around 12:40, officers began to bang on Taylor's door, setting into motion the events that eventually led to her death.
I went in bed. It's a loud knock at the door.
The detectives say they knocked on the door multiple times.
I knocked on the door, banged on it. We didn't announce the first couple because our intent was not to hit the door. Our intent was to give her plenty of time to come to the door because they said she was probably there alone.
But Taylor wasn't there alone. According to her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, he and Taylor were in bed watching a movie when they heard the knocks.
So it's a loud bang at the door. She pops up out of sleep. It scared her to death. Me too. Like, who is that?
Walker says they jumped out of bed, started getting dressed, and he grabbed his gun. At the same time, detectives took a battering ram against the door.
The door comes off the hinges. So I just let off one shot. I still can't see who it is or anything.
But Detective Mattingly says he saw them.
I'm face on about probably 20 feet away, right down the hallway. There's a bedroom door on the right, and there's the male and a female. The male's closest to the door, so he's to my right. And as I turn the doorway, he's in a stretched out position with his hands with a gun, and as soon as I clear, he fires. Boom.
Walker says shots started flying. He fell to the ground and dropped his gun. Mattingly was shot.
As soon as the shot hit, I could feel the heat in my leg. And so I just returned fire. I got 4 rounds off. And it was like simultaneous. It's boom, 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 boom.
The detective says he fired 2 more rounds and then told other officers he'd been shot. It was called over the radio at 12:43 a.m., according to a CAD report provided by the mayor. Detective Miles Cosgrove fired shots from inside the apartment. Brett Hankinson blindly fired 10 rounds from outside through a patio door, according to his termination letter.
There's just shooting, we're both on the ground, and then when all the shots stop, I'm panicking. She's right there on the ground, bleeding.
Records show 3 neighbors called 911 at 12:42, reporting shots near their apartment. 5 minutes later, after calling his mom, Walker dials 911.
911, Operator Harris, where is your emergency?
I don't know what's happening. Somebody kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend.
Okay, where are you located?
I'm at 3003 Springfield Drive, apartment 4.
3003 Springfield Drive, apartment number 4?
Yes. Oh my God.
Okay, how old is your girlfriend?
She's 26. Breathe. Oh my
You said 26,
God.
where was she shot at?
I don't know. She's on the ground right now. I don't know.
Meanwhile, officers rushed to the scene on word of an injured detective. Officers on scene put a tourniquet on Mattingly's leg as they wait for EMS.
At some point, EMS shows up. It seemed like forever. I don't know how long it took.
Mattingly was rushed to University Hospital where he went into surgery. According to the Taylor family attorneys, 120 LMPD officers went to the complex in the hours after the shooting, but no one went into the apartment to provide aid to Taylor until Walker was called out.
I'm still yelling help because she's over here coughing and I'm just freaking out. But I'm on the phone with her mom now at this point. So they keep yelling, come out. So I'm like, okay, it's the police.
Walker says police told him to drop his phone, so he does. And then he walks backwards to the officers.
I'm doing everything they're asking me to, slowly and surely. I'm scared to death.
Walker surrendered to police as SWAT moved into the apartment, finding an unresponsive Breonna Taylor on the hallway floor. Walker was arrested at the scene and taken to LMPD headquarters, where he was interrogated for several hours, the interview wrapping up around 5:30 in the morning.
I literally don't understand this at all.
Yeah.
I have no reason. I don't understand at all why they would be knocking on her door unless it was a mistake. At all. And I asked that out there a million times, why were y'all even at the door? Nobody had an answer.
That's what we're here to figure out, man.
Walker was charged with attempted murder of a police officer, a charge that was later dismissed. Later that day, LMPD briefed the media about the incident.
Victim who died is, we're still working through what her involvement was on the narcotics investigation, and her identity will be released by the coroner's office at a later date.
As police briefed the media, the Public Integrity Unit searched through Taylor's apartment. Getting a warrant right after the shooting, they spent much of the day collecting evidence, including blood, hair, fingerprints, clothing, guns, and electronics. 2 days later, on Sunday, March 15th, we first learned the name of the victim, the Jefferson County coroner identifying her as 26-year-old Breonna Taylor.
The event 6 months ago that has led us up to this moment here today, the Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron finally presenting his findings at 1:30 this afternoon. He got the case from the Louisville Metro Police Department on May 20th. And at 1:30, we did learn some new information that we had not heard before. Here's Daniel Cameron from just a few moments ago talking about the no-knock warrant.
The reports that were provided to us by the Kentucky State Police and then the FBI as it relates to ballistics. So initially we got the report from Kentucky State Police and it was inconclusive about making a determination into that fatal shot.
Daniel Cameron going on to say that the evidence shows that the officers did knock and announce, that was confirmed by independent witnesses there around the apartment complex. He also said that Kenneth Walker, evidence shows, did fire the shot that hit and injured Officer Sergeant John Mattingly. No evidence of friendly fire from other police officers striking John Mattingly. Let's go to Sinait Gabregegadis. She is also talking with other community leaders, getting reaction here on this important afternoon as we wait for the governor at 4 o'clock. Sinait?
Yeah, Doug, things are still quiet here in Jefferson Square Park after they heard the announcement, the moment everyone has been waiting for. And joining me right now is State Rep Attica Scott, District 41. Now, Attica, Rep Scott, thank you for joining us. And you've been very vocal about this case since the beginning. We've seen you out here with protesters almost every day. Tell me, where were you when the announcement was made and what was your reaction?
I was actually here at Injustice Square Park listening to the announcement. I'm disappointed, but I wasn't surprised. And I'm very clear that justice was not served today.
And at the center of this case, the controversial no-knock search warrant, which led to Breonna's death, something that you're taking part in and trying to pass the Breonna's law. We saw it passed here in Louisville, but you're trying to pass it across the Commonwealth.
That's right, and we're taking it further to address many of the issues that occurred on the night that Breonna Taylor was murdered. Not only ending no-knock warrants, but mandating that officers have their body cameras on when they issue a warrant before and afterwards, and that they submit to alcohol and drug testing when they're involved in a deadly shooting or a violent incident.
And as only Black female state lawmaker, you've said before this case really hits close to home for you. Do you feel like this is another example of justice not being served for the African American community?
This is definitely not justice for Black people. We are so used to the system not working for us that officers get away with murdering us with impunity, but we're not giving up. That's why this park is still full today, right now, even after Cameron's announcement, because people are not going to give up.
Thank you so much, Rep Scott.
Thank you.
We're going to send it back to you, Doug.
Tonight, thank you very much. Again, we've been told Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear will be reacting to the decision from the Jefferson County Grand Jury and Attorney General Daniel Cameron's announcements today, along with Charles Booker will be with him from Louisville, and J. Michael Brown. That's coming up at 4 o'clock. Joining me on the phone right now is retired local judge Tony Stringer. Spent many years on the bench here in Louisville. Judge Stringer, thank you very much. Months ago, we also started sending you some of the evidence we had been collecting as part of our investigation into this case. You were able to review some of the records there. Give me your initial opinion from what the grand jury came back with, and then some of the facts from the Attorney General.
Well, so far as what the grand jury came back with, I'm not surprised with the charges that were indicted against former Detective Hankinson. I am concerned about some of the remarks that I heard from Attorney General Cameron. Having been grand jury advisor for a number of years when I worked at the Commonwealth Attorney's Office before going to the bench, I heard some of Carl Price's, some of his comments, and what he says is true. A lot of what the grand jury does depends on the recommendation that they get from the representative from the Commonwealth that sits in there with them when the evidence is presented to the grand jury. And a lot of what they do is a result of the recommendations that they receive. So I do have to wonder what charges were recommended to the grand jury, for their consideration.
Judge Stringer, you heard Daniel Cameron pressed by several of the reporters on the racial makeup of the grand jury. Based on your involvement as a grand jury advisor. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, so far as the makeup of the grand jury is comprised of 12 citizens, and the way that they are selected is the same way that petty juries are selected. You just get 12 citizens at random based on who's in the jury pool at that particular time. So you don't really have a lot of control over the makeup of the grand jury. What you do have control over as the advisor to the grand jury is the witnesses that are presented to them, the evidence that's presented to them, and the recommendations on the charges. Because the grand jury itself is an independent body. They can really, under Kentucky law, a grand jury can do what they want to do. But under most circumstances, they confine themselves to whatever the Commonwealth's representative brings to them.
You know, toward the end of the news conference, he was asked again about the grand jury and did they consider the higher charges, manslaughter or other charges, the 4 degrees of homicide. He sort of danced around that question.
If those charges were presented to them, they would have considered them. Now, one of the things as prosecutors that you used to do, you used to look at all of the evidence that you had that was available. And any charges that you would want to file would be charges that you want to file in good faith. And if you thought that the evidence was there to support those charges, then you presented the evidence and you recommended the highest charges available. Because once a charge is indicted, you can always amend it down, but you cannot amend up.
So let me ask you, when he responded, he said, we walked them through every homicide offense. So that was his response. So that, do you take that as that he did present the full case as possible on the higher level of charges there?
No, I don't take that standing by itself to say that he recommended. I don't know if he did or not. I'm not going to second guess what he did. If he says he walked them through all of the charges, then I will accept his statement. But from my own experience, I have a different experience with that.
He ended up by saying unlikely any other charges from that night will be filed at all. It seems to be over with in his mind.
In his mind, from the standpoint of the state and what the state may do, there are other investigations that are still going on. If there are criminal charges that can be brought at the federal level in terms of civil rights violations, that's something that's still an option that is available, but I'm not going to speculate as to what's going to happen with that.
Judge Stringer, your best thoughts for Louisville, how we all move forward. You've been involved in the judicial side, the legal side, as a judge and in politics. You know the community so well. As we wrap up with you, what would you tell everybody on how we move forward in this city next?
I would tell the community that we need to come together as a community. We are all hurting right now, especially the family of Breonna Taylor and the protesters who have been out there fighting for so long, wanting to see some positive change come from the tragedy that was her death. That did not have to happen. Now, looking back at everything that we've seen over all of these days of protest, over all of the days of going through the evidence that was presented, and some of the evidence that wasn't, one thing we know for sure, there should never have been a no-knock warrant issued for Breonna Taylor's apartment. That is one fact that has already prompted change nationwide, and that's a good thing. Anytime that you have protests that leads to positive change, that's a good thing. And the protesters say that they are not finished. And I understand what they're saying. And I understand that there are still more positive changes that can come from this.
You are so
right. And one of the positive things that we do see is not only do you have black people out there in the streets protesting, you have white people, you have all other races and nationalities. This is not just local. This has gone global.
And Judge Stringer, you couldn't have described it any better. As you say those words, and I want to thank you so much for joining us here on our live phone call. We appreciate it. As you say those words, we are watching the protesters now live in the Highlands, as Judge Stringer described, all races together once again. They have just, they are going toward Grinstead Drive, or just past Grinstead Drive. They would be heading down Bardstown Road, just went past, looks like Ditto's Restaurants and some of the other high-profile places there on Bardstown Road, heading toward Eastern Parkway. Just got a word here from Attorney Sam Aguiar, the original attorney involved, along with Lonita Baker, in the Breonna Taylor case. There will be no press conference, but Ben Crump's office out of Florida will be circulating a press release on our behalf. That's coming up. Heather Fontaine has been attempting to talk to some of the police officers today, including the FOP. Heather, I know you're joining us here. I was wondering if you've been able to talk to anybody yet, or are they commenting?
I have been in touch with the FOP, Doug, and he was in Frankfurt during this announcement. He says they aren't commenting at this time, but we are in touch, and he does know that if he has a statement, he is able to reach out to me. Now, we have also been following this crowd of marchers go from Jefferson Square Park now to the Highlands, and what's interesting, Doug, is that following close behind has been police officers this entire time. You're seeing them drive by now to catch up with those protesters. Just a handful now. One thing we've noticed them continue to do is stay about a block behind these protesters at all times. We're going to continue to move so that we can stay with them through this, Doug. But again, they have been keeping their space with the protesters. Here they are now, still following single file, just a handful. I can tell you though, when this march first started, Doug, and they took off from Jefferson Square Park, there had to have been dozens of police cruisers. You do know that police cruisers were staging all through downtown. Look, you can see there's some more right here on Bardstown Road, so they're coming from Grinstead and from Bardstown Road. But of course, police were staging in the downtown Jefferson Square area. I'm telling my cameraman, let's keep walking this way with them, okay? Stay on the police officers. They were staging downtown and trying to keep other traffic out of downtown. That protesters march peacefully through the downtown area and not have to worry about abiding by traffic rules because they blocked out all traffic. As you can see, they've decided to take their own route. We're on Bardstown Road now, and again, police are staying closely behind. Earlier, Doug, I do want to give you a little bit of a story that we did witness earlier. It seemed as though some protesters, or I should say marchers, Doug, were staying kind of farther behind the group and kind of slowing that police caravan down. And that is when there were about 20 or more police cruisers that were following these marchers. They were slowing them down. At one point, officers actually had to get out of their cars to tell them to move out of the way so that they could catch up with the rest of the march. Since that moment, we've seen a lot of the police cruisers kind of veer off and head in different directions, with only this core handful of cruisers continuing to follow them. We're going to try and catch up a little bit here, Doug, but like I said, we are with the FOP. We are trying to see if they're going to be releasing a statement today, and we are continuing to watch as these police cruisers follow marchers through Louisville. Doug?
Heather, have you been able to see any interaction of the protesters with a police officer since the announcement came down? Have they been talking at least, or has there been any heated conversations you've seen?
Doug, and I'll just stay right here for a minute so we can talk to you. The only interaction I've seen is from when the cruisers were following the marchers. I believe it was closer to Floyd Avenue, and there was a handful of marchers, I would say 5 or 6, that had stayed behind. They were yelling some explicit language at the officers who were sitting in their cars. Officers eventually got out of their cars, told them they're going to have to move. Harsh words were exchanged from marchers to police officers, but they did get out of the way, and that's when we saw officers really take off to try and catch up with the rest of the crowd.
Okay, Heather, thank you very much. Heather Fontaine following the protesters, the peaceful group at the moment. They are following down Bardstown Road toward Eastern Parkway. And as we expected here, once the city put that large barricade of check-ins and a perimeter around downtown, we believed that the protests would obviously leave the downtown area, and they have, as we have seen them along Kentucky Street at one point as well. Did want to read real quickly a section here of a lengthy statement just issued by Ben Crump, one of the attorneys, saying today's news falls short of what constitutes justice. By no means does it define this moment or this moment in our history. The grand jury may have denied Breonna justice, but this decision cannot take away her legacy as a loving, vibrant young black woman who served on the front lines in the midst of a devastating pandemic. It's our hope that through the FBI's investigation, we will finally get the justice for Breonna that the grand jury refused her today. From attorney Ben Crump. And let's check in with Shay McAllister. She's following another group of protesters through the city right now. Shay?
Hey, Doug. Doug, can you hear me?
Yes.
Doug, we have seen a few windows be smashed. We're seeing tables be overturned here on Bardstown Road. We're seeing people start to hit windows and turn over tables and umbrellas. We're right near Longest on Bardstown Road, and this just started in the last 2 minutes. Up until now, we haven't seen any kind of attempts to damage anything. But now, do you look at Ramsey?
How y'all doing? Please don't record this.
Ramsey, someone just came out of Ramsey trying to ask them to leave the property alone. Trying to ask them to leave the property alone.
We ain't trying to get nobody.
But you can see, and some protesters also trying to keep them moving.
All right. Protesters.
All right, Doug, we're going to send it back to you.
Okay, Shay, thank you very much. Again, we have two reporters there along Bardstown Road. Shay was on the leading edge of the protesters, Heather Fontaine behind them. You saw some chairs being thrown around there. Shay was talking about some of the glass in the area. I didn't hear exactly what she said had happened there. Again, we're going to continue to follow the protesters as they have moved out of downtown. Downtown is still really quiet and vacant, as you can imagine. Let's go back to live pictures along Bardstown Road in the Highlands. Right after May 28th, the first protest that happened, that was a Thursday night in downtown Louisville. A small group of Black Lives Matter protesters were on the steps of the Hall of Justice. It was right after George Floyd's death as well. It was a joint rally, also talking about Breonna Taylor that night. And then, of course, we remember the riots that happened the following nights in downtown Louisville. Since then, overall, there have been skirmishes between protesters and citizens. Also, cars have been surrounded. But in general, they have been peaceful. They have been happening most every night, focusing in downtown Louisville. A small group of protesters were able to move around the city last night as well in downtown Louisville. We followed them. They stayed among the barricades and went down Jefferson Street and then up to Main Street and then back around down to Jefferson Square. Coming up here in just about 20 minutes, the Kentucky governor, along with Charles Booker of Louisville, who also joined some of those protests early on. The first night he was there, and then he spoke to many of the protesters in the days afterwards. We'll also be hearing from J. Michael Brown. You may remember J. Michael Brown when the David McAtee investigation came out. He is the one who presented the results on that. Let's talk about some of the changes that are going to be made by the city and Louisville Metro Police Department. It's going to be very important. Remember, they were part of the $12 million settlement, so important to the family of Breonna Taylor. Here's Tyler Emery.
With protesters on the streets since May 28th, city and state leaders responded with their own demands for action. But
I'd go
changed?
Back to the.
There was no LMPD body camera footage of the night Taylor was killed, which didn't violate any policy at the time. The detectives executing the search warrant on Taylor's apartment were undercover narcotics officers and weren't required to wear body cameras. In mid-May, Fisher announced all sworn officers must wear body cameras when executing any search warrants or in situations they identify themselves as police officers. Amid public pressure, then Chief Steve Conrad announced his retirement from LMPD, with Robert Schroeder set to take his place until the city hired a new chief.
If the officers don't feel in tune with their police chief, it displays itself on the street.
Then came calls for more reviews of the department.
Accountability, that's what we want to see.
We want police reform. We want you to quit policing our people, build relationships with our people.
It created a civilian review board work group with 33 Louisville leaders currently working on establishing a new board to oversee LMPD's actions and an office of the Inspector General.
That will, for the first time, have really meaningful, sustainable civilian oversight of police.
On May 28th, chants calling for change could be heard throughout downtown, leading the mayor to indefinitely suspend no-knock warrants the next day. At the start of June, the mayor announced an outside company would do a top-to-bottom review of LMPD. The city chose Chicago-based firm Hillard Heinz to review its use of force training, supervision within the department, and other systemic topics. Fisher said it's clear the city needs to reimagine what policing looks like.
We don't need any more studies. We don't need a review. We don't need another report. We need to do the work. And it's not we as in just the nonprofit community. It is everybody in this city.
Shortly after came another policy change. Interim Chief Schroeder said no officers can shoot tear gas without his or a designee's approval. 3 months from the day Taylor was killed, a law passed in her honor.
Congratulations, the ordinance passes.
And this is an opportunity, as her mother said, to save lives.
Metro Council unanimously voted to approve Breonna's law June 11th, immediately banning the use of no-knock search warrants in the city.
Don't be afraid to ask the people that you put in office to give you everything that you desire.
Chief Schroeder revealed a duty to intervene, with officers now expected to step in if they see fellow officers using excessive force or engaging in other misconduct.
We expect our officers to intervene either verbally, and they can say, hey, you need to cool down and try and resolve the situation. This just clarifies it in writing and lets the officers clearly understand what their expectation is.
Also, the city will ask Kentucky State Police to investigate officer-involved shootings independently rather than LMPD investigating themselves. Calls to defund the police rang through the city while Metro Council was finalizing the budget. It didn't take away any of the department's funds, but it did redirect what millions can be spent on. The new budget put millions towards disadvantaged neighborhoods, LMPD training, and the recruitment of a more diverse force. The Metro Public Safety Committee also introduced 2 proposals. One is an ordinance requiring officers to take drug and alcohol tests after officer-involved critical incidents. The other is a resolution aiming to increase transparency and expedite investigations involving LMPD officers. Metro Council voted to approve the resolution on transparent investigations August 6th.
Say her name!
Breonna Taylor! Kentucky U.S. Senator Rand Paul also named federal legislation in Breonna's honor. In June, Paul unveiled the Justice for Breonna Taylor Act, which would ban no-knock search warrants nationwide. At the state level, senators in Frankfort also announced in July they'll create a bill to ban no-knock warrants. But protesters told us over the months these proposals, investigations, and policy revisions still aren't enough. Their push for change continues.
And we can go over the no-knock warrant issue here a little bit more because it was clarified by the Kentucky Attorney General, and he has just released a statement about his news conference today. And in writing, he says the officers were advised by superiors to knock and announce their presence in serving this specific search warrant. Evidence from the investigation shows that officers both knocked and announced their presence at the apartment. The officers' statements about their announcement are corroborated by one independent witness who was in proximity to Ms. Taylor's apartment. The officers indeed say in their recorded interviews that they changed the warrant from no knock to knock, and one of those interviews was done 2 weeks after the shooting. I neglected to point that out earlier, and I wanted to make that clearer here. Now let's check in with Shay McAllister again along Bardstown Road, and we have seen some chairs being thrown over. How are things right now, Shay, and where exactly are you?
Hey Doug, so we're on Bardstown Road right before Eastern Parkway. Over here, what's happening as we speak is a confrontation, a meet in the road between police and protesters. It's the first time that we've seen this in the more than 3 miles we have marched from downtown Louisville. Officers pulling up in their police cruisers, lining up in a line here on Bardstown Road and meeting up with protesters face to face. This just happened in the last 2 minutes. This comes, Doug, after we watched at least 2 different businesses have windows smashed in. On one business, patio furniture flipped over and thrown around. We also saw another business where a woman came out, an employee, saying, "We stand with you, please, not ours." And the protesters did keep moving. So now we're watching as it looks like there's conversations happening between police and protesters.